Anupam Malhotra is the Director of Connectivity and Data at Audi of America. And you've got some interesting views on how this automotive industry is going to evolve as we get into autonomy and mobility. Take it from there, please.
Thank you, yes. As traditional automakers, we look at this space in terms of what the impact is from a customer standpoint, from a technology standpoint, and from a business model standpoint. And as planners, we have to look at how do we think these different megatrends that we're seeing out there are going to become mainstream. So if you look at some of the biggest trends that are out there, you see certainly there's a change in customer that's happening. Today we look at about 15% of our buying population being millennials. That's going to change to about 75% in 2025. These millennials have grown up with a very different view on technology and the kinds of conveniences and comforts that you get from technology, and that changes their aspirations, it changes their expectations from the kinds of experiences that they want both in the vehicle and outside. But then as you look at what are the technological trends that are really changing things, and I think whether you're inside the industry or an industry watcher, everybody's coalescing around four big megatrends, and it's connectivity, autonomous driving, shared mobility, and electrification. And now as planners, you have to go in and say, okay, well, what's the impact on the business model? I mean, is all of this going to suddenly disrupt and throw open everything we've built in the last 100 years? Or is there some method to this madness in terms of how it rolls out? So what we're talking about is let's look at these technologies, let's look at some of the signs that we are seeing right now. Let's look at some of the trends in terms of how they typically evolve, both in terms of hype curves and S-curves and how the two match together. And then let's look at when exactly do we think these technologies become mainstream and what could be the drivers to bring them mainstream. So today's talk is really going to be about what we're seeing in the connectivity space, which really has become mainstream already. And you've got now the reality behind what connectivity can do for the consumer in the car as well as for the business of automotive, being driven home by things like Audi Connect, for instance, which is Audi's service, which we started in 2010. Things like Wi-Fi hotspots in cars, communication with city infrastructure through systems like traffic light information. But more importantly, as we start looking down the road, we see things like 5G coming on the horizon. We see data becoming an important part of the overall value equation in terms of how you monetize and also how you bring new subscription services to market. So as we look at this, we say, okay, connectivity seems like this is mainstream now. And now the role of connectivity is not so much that connectivity per se becomes the important thing, it's what does connectivity enable in the future? Is it data, is it convenience, is it comfort, is it making the other megatrends come to fruition? So as we look forward, we're looking at electrification coming to the market. Electrification is going to be a huge mainstream trend in the next 5 to 6 years, and we think that's really where the industry is going to evolve to next. You're going to see a huge emphasis coming, initiated through regulation, and also now embraced by the automotive industry. Audi has announced about 20 electric and plug-in electric hybrid models in the next 5 to 6 years by 2020. And that's just part of a huge push to say we know the customer's changing, but we also know that the fact that we have connected vehicles really improves the ability for us to offer a better electric vehicle experience. And we think we're going to build on that foundation, and through that, really bring electrification out there through the Audi e-tron, which comes next year.
Okay, you talked about changing the business model. How might Audi make money differently than it does today? You mentioned things like data and subscription services. What kind of money can you make off that, and what other things are you looking at?
Yeah, well, let's be very clear. I think the fundamental ownership model for a vehicle is not changing for a while. So we think that there are some other ways in which you will start looking at monetizing through connectivity and data. We've obviously evolved to a subscription model that is quite prevalent today and successful. We think data monetization holds a lot of promise. I think how we actually instantiate it will become clear in the next couple of years. We think electric vehicles have a huge promise, a huge societal impact promise that comes from how electrification can really reduce the amount of emissions impact that we have as a society. But then as you go forward and you start looking at things like shared mobility, where transportation is more as a service than as a ownership model. Today you see these impacting taxi services and car rental services. They're not necessarily impacting the automotive ownership model right now. But what is happening is that the customer is getting a taste for a different kind of way of getting access to transportation, much more convenient and much more easy. So as that happens, we think those trends will translate, at least in urban environments, into the industry as well. And so we're looking at new ways of doing, for instance, a subscription model for cars instead of just the typical financing and leasing models. And that could be a source of revenue. And then as you go far out, you start seeing where autonomous driving really makes an impact. And this is where you start looking at, even though autonomous vehicles per se are not a disruptor to the automotive business model, if I had an autonomous vehicle that I could sell today, I would do it because it's a unique selling proposition. It's a way to create value immediately in a way you can control. The problem with autonomous vehicles right now is that the regulatory framework is very complex in this country. We have about 70 new regulations that have come up since January 2017, and it's fragmented across the country. And you have a society that's not quite ready yet. Consumer confidence in these vehicles is low, but it has a lot of promise for the future, and we think that it's going to build upon some of the other trends. So for instance, shared mobility increases vehicle miles traveled, which you have a concern about, but if you have electrification, then you can reduce the impact of those vehicle miles traveled. On the other hand, autonomous vehicles has a huge impact in terms of pricing in the car, but typically in the normal model, you would have to put that in the top line of the vehicle itself. But if you really want more impact, what you need is maybe shared fleets of autonomous vehicles. And how could shared fleets of autonomous vehicles really group together to create a much bigger impact and much faster mainstreaming of these technologies? It's conceivable in the future that you have transportation service providers becoming much bigger and buying the hardware from automakers, but as a service provider, really providing a new service value proposition. So I think this is some of the ways in which you're going to start seeing changes in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Real good. Pam, thanks for this peek under the tent, so to speak, of Audi's viewpoint on where this is all going from a new business model standpoint.
Thank you.
Thanks.